Alright, so I wanted to talk today about toxic femininity. As we all know, the YouTube shooting has been going around the news, and I'm really not going to talk about that because many other people are covering that. But it does bring to mind an article I wrote last week and a topic that I have been discussing lately, which is toxic femininity. Because in this day and age, we hear endless rants on toxic masculinity, which exists, but from my point of view, I think toxic femininity is far more common these days. So I just wanted to talk to you guys about that. So toxic femininity is basically ultimate power with no responsibility. That ultimate power comes from sexual marketplace value. So young women in particular fall into this trap, although old women can be toxic as well, which I'll talk about that a little bit later. And again, their power comes from, or our power comes from our sexuality. And the way our society is structured these days, women have very little in the way of responsibilities. We have endless opportunities. We are empowered in the workplace. We're empowered in family courts. We are empowered to, if we want to be a stay-at-home mom, we can do that, even though, of course, it's discouraged, but you can still do it. We are empowered to divorce men and take half of their money. I mean, we're empowered in all kinds of ways. So, but there's not really a limiting responsibility that goes along with that. We just have power. You know, we have no fault divorce when it comes to divorce, so there's no burden of proof to determine whether or not the marriage should end. It's just a free, get out of jail free card. When it comes to the workplace or employment, we don't really have the responsibility of supporting a family. There are, of course, single mothers, but oftentimes they get subsidized by the government to maintain their lifestyle, so that's yet another lack of responsibility. But I'm not saying there aren't working women who have children who do support their families, but there's really no societal burden to support a family if you're a woman. And there's certainly no burden of being virtuous. There's no expectation of any level of appropriate behavior for women anymore. Pretty much you can act, it's literally acceptable these days to be a sugar baby, which, as I discussed a few months back in a poll, is just being a prostitute. Hate to break it to you, but it's socially acceptable to be a prostitute these days, so that should give you a good example of how much liberty and freedom we have as women and how little constraint is placed on our behavior. And so this leads a lot of unscrupulous women to down the road of toxicity, because most people, and this isn't even just women, but most people really aren't very self-aware, and we need societal input to encourage us and to steer us into the direction of virtuous behavior. Most people aren't going to come to that stuff on their own. They need some sort of outside influence and enticement to behave properly, and there's very little of that for women these days. So some features of toxic femininity are immaturity, irrationality, vindictiveness, viciousness. These are the kinds of women who create their own drama for fun. They like stirring up, they like stirring the pot because they get bored. A lot of times these toxic women haven't really developed their personalities very much, or their hobbies or skills. And so they don't have a lot to fall back on when it comes to keeping themselves entertained and interested and engaged in life. So what they do is they create dramatic situations and pick fights for entertainment. And Some of it, I mean, a lot of it's really unconscious, but that doesn't mean it's excusable. But a lot of toxic femininity too is just letting your emotions rule and letting negative emotions rule in particular, because it's okay to sort of let positive emotions run free, but negative emotions are really what we need to learn to control and steer in a more productive direction. And it's okay to feel negative emotions, obviously, but if they rule your life, then your life is going to be ruled by negativity. And toxic women who let negative emotions rule are basically tyrants because they completely abdicate responsibility both for their own actions and for their emotions and the consequences of those. So there's no reasoning with them. There's very little ability to resolve conflict with them because they act like the conflict came out of nowhere, that it just has nothing to do with them, that they're just caught up in all of this. They are basically helpless victims. And again, that's that abdication of responsibility I was talking about. So one example I talked about last week of toxic femininity is a woman I know who, she's married with 2 children. Her husband works, she does not, which I think is great, but there are many things about their relationship that's not great. And she is not, she's pretty, well, before she got pregnant, she was probably like a solid 7, maybe an 8, depending on, if you were into redheads or whatever. But after she had kids, she just gained a lot of weight and has never really made any effort to lose it. So I would say she's probably more of like a 4 now, or maybe 5 if you factor in the fact that obesity and being overweight is so common in America. So she's not very attractive anymore, is my point. But she was, and when she was growing up, she had very little responsibility placed on her by her parents. They basically thought, she's a daughter, she can do no wrong. So she was completely indulged. She was never, very few rules were enforced against her. She didn't have any responsibilities growing up. She was just able to get away with whatever she wanted, and she was able to take things from her other siblings with no consequences and blame them for every misdeed she did. Basically, was all of her most rotten natural tendencies were completely encouraged by her parents. So this created a rather toxic adult. So she has children now, and she still acts like a child in many ways. And one thing I've seen her do a lot is she will take out her emotions on the nearest kicking post. And usually that nearest kicking post is her husband, because a lot of other people won't put up with it. I'll get into that more later. But so the example that I sort of gave last week was that I've seen her before where she's doing her homework on her laptop and something about the program isn't working for her, and so she just starts panicking and just gets really frustrated, and instead of taking a deep breath and taking a step back, or maybe even just asking for help, she just starts a tantrum, basically. And of course her husband sees this and wants to help her. Poor guy. But he wants to help her, he wants to solve the problem, and he wants, of course, her to stop throwing a fit, because it's just not good for anyone. And so he basically steps in and he fixes the problem, because it really wasn't a very big obstacle, she was just making it seem like one. And so instead of being grateful for this, being the toxic woman she is, she gets mad at him. Because basically she has no self-awareness, no sense of emotional regulation to where she can understand that, okay, I really worked myself up, I'm really upset right now, but the problem is gone, but these feelings are still lingering because I was worked into such a state. I mean, most well put together adults understand that sometimes you can have sort of an emotional hangover with certain situations. You know, you feel really bad about something or you're really nervous, and then the event, whatever it may be, occurs, and you're still sort of feeling those residual emotions afterward. And so most people just take that in stride and assume and understand it's going to go away in a few minutes. But instead of this, she decides to explode at her husband and blame him for her anger. So she essentially picks a fight at him and makes it about some other issue that doesn't even exist, but she acts like it's an issue they've been having for years, and oh, he's always like this, and you should know better, and just completely turning the tables on him. And for a minute, he'll argue back and forth with her until eventually he just sort of gives up and realizes that it's not actually a fight about anything. It's really just her emotional word vomit. So he ignores her, and she eventually shuts up. But she just sits there and stews in her emotions and is essentially giving her husband the side eye for a few hours, just mad at him. And this goes on a regular basis. And I won't say her husband is not involved. You know, he could stand up to her. And I mean, he does push back. He says, you know, this fight isn't even about me. You're just upset because of your computer, and she'll just escalate, basically. She's basically winning the argument by being the loudest one in the room, and he just basically ignores her. He shuts off, and he should grow a pair. Yeah, the sad thing is he's a really masculine man, but he had a very domineering mother who is constantly ordering her husband around and henpecking and that kind of thing, so I think he's sort of used to the dynamic, and despite the fact that he has so many masculine qualities, he still allows himself to be henpecked like this. Not even henpecked, that's not fair. I mean, she just emotionally dumps on him. So yeah, that's a really good example of toxic femininity at work. And it's really unhealthy for everyone. I mean, she's not happy, he's not happy, her children are learning a messed up dynamic, and just the world is a darker place for women like this. And I guess I mentioned earlier that, you know, older women can be toxic too. Obviously, I mentioned that beauty is the source of power when it comes to toxic women, but women can become doubly toxic once they lose that beauty. So women who developed no virtue when they were younger and who have lost that power feel completely helpless. So instead of developing their positive traits, if they had any, but everyone can develop some kind of positive trait if they try, but instead of trying to improve themselves, they double down on their viciousness and blame the world for their powerlessness and for their unhappiness. So just beware of toxic women. I guess signs that a woman is toxic. I mean, there are plenty of other articles out there about this. But if a woman has regular outbursts or takes no responsibility for any of her actions, or say there's some little frustration at the grocery store, you know, the line's moving too slowly, does she start throwing a tantrum, or does she get really frustrated, or is she just patient? Or if there's some kind of misunderstanding or disagreement between you two, how does that get resolved? So there are lots of little signs that a woman is toxic that you can look out for. What else? Yeah, I mean, really, you have to listen to the way that they talk, you know? You have to listen to the thought patterns that are behind the stories they tell. So if when they tell stories, they're never an actor in the situation unless something good is happening. If something bad happens in the story, it's always someone else's fault. That's a sign. Because that's a sign that they can't even see or understand or completely deny any role in anything negative happening in their life. So that's a big thing to look for, is the way they talk. So I hope this sheds some light on the epidemic of toxic women that are out there, and that's all I've got for today.